Okay, so welcome back. Today we are going to talk about two-dimensional arrays, and we're going to talk about C Sharp. Again, the concepts apply to just about any programming language where you have arrays. But we're going to talk about arrays and why you might use them and how you can implement them and how they work under the hood so you can get a better understanding. Now, if you've done any work with arrays in the past in any language, you're probably aware that they can be kind of confusing. There's a lot to arrays, especially when you deal with multi-dimensional arrays like we're going to talk about. So we're going to try to help you demystify arrays and help you to understand them a lot better. Now, it's guaranteed when you talk about arrays, the hobbyists and newbies are going to jump up and down and say, hey, wait a minute. In C Sharp, why don't you use lists? Arrays are old, lists are new. That means they're best, right? Well, unfortunately for the hobbies and newbies, as with everything in the science engineering world, the answer is generally it depends. What tool you use depends on the cost and the benefit of the tool. Sometimes arrays are good, sometimes lists are good, sometimes both are good. So let's talk about when you might want to use arrays. And we're going to start with a typical two-dimensional array. And you can see here I've got a spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet, and I've got some sets of data. And you can see there's pairs of data, and these pairs of data represent time and value that is associated with, for example, if you're sampling some quantity in this case, every 1/10 of a second, we've got a time and the sampled value associated with that time. So these pairs of data go together. So this is a great example of why you might want to use arrays. Now, you can use lists for this, where you've got pairs of data, but it can get kind of complicated. So in this case, it might be better to use arrays, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, why else might you want to use arrays? Well, you can see here we've got a spreadsheet, and it's got columns and it has rows. And there are multiple columns and multiple rows. So how are you going to store data in this spreadsheet? Well, a great tool to do that is using arrays, where an array has a row and a column defining each bit of data. And here you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns and 13 rows, and you need some way to store that data, and a great option is arrays. Now, you could do that with lists, but you have to have a list of a list of a list of a list, and it can get very, very complicated. So in some cases, arrays are really good. Now, another case where you might want to use arrays is in C Sharp. Some functions provided in C Sharp will work with arrays, and they will return an array. For example, if you do a string.split, it returns an array of strings. So there's multiple cases where you would want to use arrays. So what we're going to talk about in this video is we're going to focus in on two-dimensional arrays to help you understand them, and the concepts will extend to multi-dimensional arrays. So here we have, like I said, we've got 11 time values, and associated with each time value, we have a sample value. So each of these pairs of values go together. So we might have an array of these pairs of values. Now, one of the challenges about arrays is not only do you have this data stored in the array, but you also have to deal with some other data associated with the array. One of them is you need to think about how much data is in the array. And the reason you need to do that is you need to store that data in your memory, in your RAM, and the operating system requires that you tell it how much RAM do you need to store this data so it can reserve it. So up front, you need to determine how many values are going to be in the array. So aside from the actual data, the time and value, you also need to have an idea of how many rows and how many columns are going to be occupied by this array. And here we've got 11 rows and 2 columns of data. So not only do you have the data, you've got to remember that you've got 11 rows and 2 columns. Now you also need to be able to access each of those elements. So there's more data you need to be aware of, and that is some way to address each of these elements. So say I want this value here at time 0.5, I need to have a way to address that particular element. So not only do I need to have information on how many elements total, how many rows and columns, but also some way to address each element. So now here is our sets of values, and as we said, we've got 11 pairs of 2 values. So each of these values is a double, so we need to tell the operating system, hey, I need 11 by 2 sets of doubles. So we've got the first number is 11, which is how many rows of data, and 2 is how many columns. So this B and C means there's 2. So it's just like with a spreadsheet. If we want to access A1, we give it an index of A1. If we want to access this, it's C11. With the array, this is going to be row 8, column 1. So this is column 1 of your array, column 0, and here's row 0, row 1, row 2, and so on. So you initially need to define this array as a double with 11 rows and 2 columns. So it's a double 11, 2. Now we said you also need to have the addresses of each of these values, and that's where these indices come in. So if I want to address this first element, I have to address row 0, and you can see there's a 0 here, column 0. Row 0, column 0. This one is row 5, column 1. So that's the basics of how you have to deal with arrays. You need to know how many elements. You need to define it as 11 rows and 2 columns. You need to have addressing for those elements where you have an index of the row number and then the column number. And then you've also got the data. So there's a lot going on with arrays. Now, you can also define different properties of this array. For example, there is a length property. And the length property basically means how many total elements are in your array. So we've got 11 rows and 2 columns, so 2 times 11 is 22. So that is the length of the array. It's basically 22 elements. So now let's say we want to find out for a given array how many rows or how many columns it has. Well, since the rows are defined by the 0th or first element in the array, you use the getLength method and feed it a 0, which defines the rows. And in this case, it will say there are 11 because they go from 0 to 10. If we want to get the number of columns, which is the 1th element or the first element, you say getLength 1, and that tells you there's 2 columns. So pretty straightforward, but you just have to keep in mind what length means in these different situations. So let's say we want to know how many dimensions this array has. Well, it's a 2-dimension array, so we can get that by asking for the rank, and it will return 2, which is the number of dimensions of the array. And this is one of those things that can get kind of confusing because all the rank tells you is it's like saying I've got a rectangle with a height and a width. It just tells you there's 2 dimensions, but it doesn't tell you what those dimensions are. In our case, we have an array with 11 rows and 2 columns, but still it's just a 2-dimensional array. We can also extract the bound. The lower bound of the rows, which is the 0th element, is 0, because that's the first index of the rows, and the upper bound of the rows is 10, because the last element is index 10. Same thing we can do for the columns. The upper bound of the columns, or the 1th element, is 1, the lower bound is 0. So let's say we want to extract this last time value. How would we do it? Well, we can say for this array, the time value array dot-get upper bound of the 0 or row element and the 0th element. So now let's take a look at a simple C# Visual Studio Windows Forms application and see how we might implement an array. I've got the basic form here and I've added a text box so it will print out some of the values of our array. We go into our application and what we've done here, the first line after our initialized component, we are defining a time value array with the values we showed before. And after that, we just got some text box, append text, to spit out some of the values of the array we talked about, the rank, the upper bounds, and so on. So let's see how we can define a two-dimensional array. So first thing is we've got double, and in brackets we've got a single comma. What that says is this is a two-dimensional array. Basically, we're defining a spreadsheet that's got rows and columns. If it had two commas, it would be a three-dimensional array. We're just talking about a two-dimensional array. We haven't told it how many elements. We're just saying, hey, we're defining a spreadsheet or a two-dimensional array of doubles. We're going to call it time value array, and we're instantiating a new two-dimensional array of doubles. And here's how we can initialize the values of the array. And here we've got our 11 rows and 2 columns, and here's our time and value for each sample. So this is one way to initialize it. And again, you have to tell the operating system how much RAM you want to store. And by putting in these values, we are saying we want to store these 22 values of doubles. Now, you don't need to initialize it. You can just say double with 11, 2, and that will give us a blank array that we can fill in later. But here's a nice way to initialize it with actual values. So that's basically what you're doing when you're initializing an array, but you do have to tell it how many values you want to store. So here is our text box 1 append text. And what we're doing is we are going to give the rank. We said before the rank is basically, is it a two-dimensional array or three-dimensional, whatever. The upper bound of the rows, the upper bound of the columns, the lower bound of the rows, the lower bound of the columns, the length of the rows, the length of the columns, and the last time value array. So let's run this and see what we get. So here's our output. Our rank is 2. Again, it's a two-dimensional array. The upper bound is 10, which is the 10th row. The upper bound of the columns is 1. Lower bound of the rows is 0. Lower bound of the ones is 0. The columns is 0. The length is 22 elements. Get length 0, which is the length of the rows is 11. The length of the columns is 2. And the last time value array is 1.1. So that's kind of the basics of two-dimensional arrays in C# or most other programming languages. If you like any of these videos, I encourage you to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications, but most of all, please let others know that we're here so we get some views. Really appreciate it. Otherwise, take care. Have a really good day. Thanks.